So, hello guys. So today I thought that I should make a video about basically building the ultimate Windows 98, Windows XP and DOS PC. So basically I was kind of inspired by Matt Casey videos on, making the best officially supported Windows 98 PC, and there were a couple of issues with it. So first of all, he couldn't get like the SATA drives to work on it, and we also now have the ability to be able to use Nvidia graphics card, and in particular the Geforce 7 series cards, which I will talk about later. And I've also made a bit more research on basically all types of motherboards, and I also have a few experience with a few of them. So, for example, the Pentium 3, the Athlon XP, as well as the Athlon X2 and the Enforce motherboards. And I also was able to try a couple of graphics cards, and including a few of them that died on me. So we will also talk about those as well. So what do we want from the ultimate PC? So first of all, we want to have the best compatibility with Win32 apps. So it doesn't matter if it is like 16 bits or 32 bits. Now, we also need to have at least decent DOS compatibility as well, and EX and A3D sound support if possible, getting the best performance out of it. So basically, unlike saying like, oh, let's just go with a Super Socket 7 motherboard and use a K6. In this case, we really want to have like be able to run like the latest and greatest stuff if possible. And the OS and drivers should mostly work, be stable. Well, they shouldn't like crash after 10 minutes or so. So that's the whole point of it. And be as cheap as possible, which is kind of my goal with this computer. Now we will also look at the ideal conditions. So basically, like if you have the money to afford such cards, doesn't matter if it's a sound card or a graphics card, and power consumption and size should be as low and small as possible. Now, this may not matter to you, but uh, in my opinion, it's not fun, to have like a huge case that you have to lug around. So if you can have like a smaller PC that can do the same thing, then it's ideal in my opinion. So motherboard type and generation is important. So we will take a look at a few of them. So socket 370, which is the Pentium 3, and that does include the duality processors. Socket A, which is basically the Athlon XP, and the Duron processors. Socket 478, which is basically the Pentium 4, and LGA 775, which is the Core 2 Duo and the Pentium D, and LGA 1155, which is Nehalem, Westmere, etc. Now, we could also go beyond that, but the issue is that after LGA 1155, they actually remove PCI support. So on later boards, sometimes they use PCI Express to PCI bridge chip, and that may work in some cases, but in some others, it's not too great. So especially with sound cards, so we will see about those. So let's take a look first at socket 370, which is basically the generation for Pentium 3. Now, there are several good things about it. So unlike the Super Socket 7 motherboards, they have ATX, the 20-pin variants, of course. They also have usually IDE, and most of the early ones, they at least have one ISS slot. and some of them, well, most of them have at least AGP. Yeah, now it's usually at 2x, but there are also 4x AGP connectors, which is what you want, preferably because the later AGP GPUs, they are only 4x and 8x, and finding a decently powerful 8x AGP card uh, and 4x card, it can be difficult, especially if it's the universal kind. So yeah. Now, on some motherboards, it's possible to to just modify the AGP connector, and most cards will work on it. But I would mostly avoid doing that because we really don't want to damage the motherboard in such a way. So most motherboards, as I said, have at least one ISS slot. Some of them have two, but for the most part, most of them should have at least one. Now, there are some, such as the Apollo 266 ones, those, none of them have ISS slots. So that can be an issue. And in that case, you could argue that, well, you might as well go with the socket A motherboard instead of, using that one. And they usually have pretty good DOS compatibility, even with PCI sound cards. Because the funny thing is that some Super Socket 7 motherboards, they may not actually work with PCI sound cards in DOS. So that's how, yeah, it's a bit ironic, if I get to say. And the other thing that I noticed is that even with copper mined P3s, they don't consume a lot of power. The processor itself, they usually don't exceed 35 watts. So yeah, it's pretty easy to get under the 100 watts bar. So that's pretty nice. Now the issue is that, of course, they are RAM limited. So usually the ceiling is 1 GB or 1/2 GB. So now that should be plenty in such cases, but there might be a game, a Windows game in particular, that could exceed that. So yeah, that might be an issue for some. Uh, the motherboard that I bought, which is the one that you are seeing here, the capacitors on it were dead. So, and the motherboard still sort of works, but the capacitors are still faulty. So I'll have to replace them, and you probably should as well if you end up with such a board. The IO speed is pretty slow compared to newer generation. So in the case of this motherboard, it is at best UGMA 66, which is plenty in my opinion, and you will still notice a decent improvement with an SSD, but still, if we compare it to like Athlon XP boards, it is at least double that. So yeah, keep that in mind. So yeah, as I said earlier, the capacitors should be replaced if possible. And you should also avoid power-hungry AGP cards. So that includes the GeForce 3, the GeForce 4, and I believe some of the Radeon cards as well. Now, the Radeon cards, usually they will have like a Molex connector, so these should not be an issue. But the issue with the GeForce 3 and the GeForce 4 is that they don't use any Molex connector, sorry, but they consume a lot of power. So, for example, the GeForce 4, it can consume up to 40 watts through the AGP slot. and I actually managed to damage the card when inserting it in my motherboard. Now, in some other cases, you may actually kill and the motherboard and the graphics card, especially if you try to overclock the GeForce 4 or the GeForce 3. So I would definitely avoid overclocking these cards because you can actually kill them. But unfortunately, you cannot really underclock them because they don't have like a VBIOS that you can modify to change the clocks, at least not as easily. And as far as chipsets goes, sorry, you should pretty much go with the Apollo 133A, which supports 8GP4X, and they also have ISS slots. Uh, Now, some chipsets, especially the Intel ones, they may not support like some big RAM sticks, so you may stick with smaller ones in some cases. And as I said earlier, there are later chipsets that also support duality processors, but they don't have ISA slots, so they are kind of pointless. Some of them may have SB link connectors, so this may still be a good option, but I wasn't able to find any with SB link connectors. So yeah, one thing that I wanted to mention is that I was trying the last remnant on the Pentium 3, and I encountered this very weird issue. And when I tried the same hard drive, the same GPU on the socket A motherboard, it worked just fine. Now, this could be down to the bulky capacitors, but this could also be down to driver issues. And I tried like several drivers, and I wasn't able to get this to work properly. That was on Windows XP, by the way. So yeah, and the same game on the Athlon XP, it worked just fine. There were no graphical glitches. So yeah, that's a bit unfortunate and something that you need to keep in mind. So next up we have the socket A. They are pretty cheap and easy to find. They are pretty much also the best 32-bit processors that you can find, short of course, the transmitter processors. Those will have SSC2. This one will not have SSC2. The DOS compatibility is pretty decent with PCI sound cards. Now, you won't have SV link connectors on these, unfortunately, but you can still use, say, a Sound Blaster Live on it in DOS mode. So if you only care about some compatibility with DOS and mostly care about EAX and Windows 95 and Windows XP on the side as well, this is a pretty decent option. Now, of course, none of them, except for one motherboard, have ISA slots. Now, the motherboard that does have an ISA slot is the BioStar M7 PC in action. Well, yeah, this motherboard, if you find it, I would definitely buy it because it's pretty good actually. Say that on some socket A motherboards, they will only work with SATA 1 drives. So unfortunately, some VIA chipsets with SATA, they will not work with newer SATA drives because there is a hardware bug that prevents these drives from working. So my recommendation is to simply use an IDE to SATA adapter. But there is an issue with using two of them because if you attempt to use, like, say, two IDE to SATA adapters, your system may not actually boot, like it will freeze. That is what happened in my motherboard. So you may actually want to stick with either say an IDE drive and a SATA drive, and only one of them, or you may simply just want to have like say one SATA drive, and then for the CD-ROM drive or the DVD drive, you can use an external one, so a USB one. So that's another option as well. And as I said earlier, they don't support SSE for the CPU. So some web browsers, especially the later versions, they will not work. And I also noticed that they were also quite power hungry. So I've noticed that they consume as much power as the Pentium 4s in some cases. Now they are usually like 10 watts lower than the Pentium 4s, but it's still a noticeable difference. And it's also quite easy to kill them if you don't have a proper cooling solution, because they don't have temperatures sensors on them. So it's actually possible to cook an egg on the CPU because of that. Now, the capacitors on these boards, they are usually pretty decent, but you should still watch out for them. And same issue with the AGP cards. I would definitely avoid using the GeForce 3 and 4. And as I said earlier, the SATA on these motherboards, you can pretty much forget about them. And in my opinion, it's a decent platform for Windows 98. Now, let's take a look at the socket 478. So they are quite easy to find and pretty cheap. Motherboards, a bit less. The processors themselves are pretty easy, but the motherboards on their own, not so much. And especially the kinds that have SB link connectors, because there are actually quite a few of them by QDI and ECS that do have SB link connectors. And if you have like the Eagle or Yamaha PCI sound cards, you pretty much want to have SB link available and use that if possible, because this will pretty much mimic, well, not mimic, to the operating system. So DOS, Windows 95, it will pretty much appear as an ISA sound card. So the compatibility on such boards should be pretty much excellent. And the ISH5 was the last chipset to support the Sound Blaster Live. So if you use like an ISH7 chipset, the live sound card under DOS will not work. And in fact, you may not even be able to install the Windows 98 drivers unless you disable the SB16 emulation drivers. So keep that in mind. The Celeron processors, you should definitely avoid them because they perform even worse than some of the Super Socket 7 processors. So that should give you an idea of how bad it is. And there are actually quite a few Socket 4778 motherboards that do feature ISA slots, but it's you are more likely to find motherboards with SB link connectors. They consume quite a bit of power as well, so I would recommend that you get a decent cooler if your motherboard does not come with one. Now, yeah, as I said earlier, some motherboards may have SB link, or they will have SB link headers, so you can say solder your own connector yourself. So basically, like, they will have the pads on the motherboard that it will not be soldered on. So if that's the case on your motherboard, then you should definitely solder one at least. Now, some Pentium 4s, they do support 64-bit operating systems. It's not something that I would recommend because they are pretty bad processors. especially in 64 bits processors. But OS, sorry. But if you want to play like a 2D game, for example, that is 64 bits only, that's certainly an option. And if you have the motherboard, it is a pretty good option for DOS and Windows 95. And especially if you use SB-Link. In that case, I would be happy with such a motherboard. So this is what SB-Link looks like. So on the left, you can see SB-Link on the sound card itself, and on the right, you can see SB-Link on the motherboard. So let's take a look at the next generation. So LGA775. Now, the Core 2 Duos processors, they are a lot faster than the Petit 4s and the Athlon XPs. In fact, it's still possible to use one in modern tasks. So, for example, you can still use the latest browsers on them. So that's how good they are performance-wise. And you should also seek out LGA775 motherboards with VIA chipsets because they still retain sound compatibility with PCI sound cards. Now, they still won't work with distributed DMA or DDMA, but they will work at least with the ESS card in TDMA mode. So the compatibility should still be pretty good. Not excellent, but better than some of the other motherboard, older motherboards even. And that was the last socket with AGP support. Now, most of them were PCI Express, but a few of them featured AGP slots, or in some cases, they would feature both AGP and PCI Express. They are also more energy efficient, especially the Celeron based processors, which unlike the Celeron D, they will actually outperform Pentium 3s, and even the Duality P3s. And PCI Express cards are much easier to find, especially for the Geforce 6 and 7, and also for the Radeon cards as well. Because the issue with AGP cards is that, first of all, they tend to die very easily, and secondly, they are very, very, very expensive because people are seeking out these cards for older motherboards. So as a result, it can be quite difficult to find AGP cards for a decent price. And ICH7 is the last chipset to support the throttle utility. So the reason why you want this tool to work on under DOS is because it provides an easy way to play older games and have basically no TSR in the background. So this should allow you to play older games that are speed sensitive. Now, I'm not actually sure if it will slow it down enough to play Frogger, for example. But that's an option for at least 386 games that are speed sensitive. So it is a good option to have. Now, under Windows, that's less of an issue because there are programs that can throttle in the background. And that will work no matter your CPU or motherboard or chipset or whatever. So yeah, for Windows, you should not worry about that. This is mostly about DOS. Now there is another alternative, but that one uses a TSR. So this may be okay for some older games, but for some games that require their own DOS extender, that may not work. So yeah, and the issue with such motherboards is that none of them have ISA slots or SV-Link. And in the rare case that they feature ISA slots, the sound cards are unlikely to work on them because they probably won't support DMA. So you could get like FM working, but you would not get DMA working on them. And you should also be careful when you select your components because, for example, as I said earlier, the Sound Blaster Live will not work under DOS with it. Now, it will still work under Windows 95, and that could be an option for you. But some sound cards will not work on such motherboard, and you will even need to be careful about the chipset on them. So if you use, say, ICH7, as I said earlier, there are only a few sound cards that will work on them. Most of them will not work on the DOS. So that's why I said that you should seek out the VIA chipsets with that socket, because you should at least be able to use the ESS sound cards as well as the ALS sound cards as well. And because of that, it still won't be as compatible with motherboards with SB-Link or ISA slots. So as I said earlier, prefer motherboards with VIA chipsets if possible. Most of them are PCI Express, as I said earlier. AGP systems, they are quite expensive and they are more prone to failure as well. So my recommendation is to avoid them completely. All right, now it used to be possible to find them for cheap, but now it's almost impossible to find them. And unlike what some people might tell you, PCI Express graphics card, they work perfectly on Windows 95. That's not an issue at all. Like, there is no difference to the operating system between AGP and PCI Express, at least from a driver point of view. The only thing that you need to care about is whether or not your GPU is actually supported. And you may want to have another system in addition to this one for DOS compatibility, even in the best case scenario. And unlike the older processors and motherboards, they do actually have decent 64-bit supports. Even in, Windows 11 will not work on them, at least without a registry hack, but it will still be possible to use Linux on them, and Windows 10 should still work fine. And you really need to be careful with Windows 95 because some motherboards, first of all, they will only support AHCI mode, for example. In some cases, they will not even have IDE mode, or at least it won't be as obvious. Now, it is actually possible to install Windows 95 on motherboards with AHCI forced, but you need to be careful about that. You basically need to reinstall a Windows 95 on another computer and then insert the unofficial AHCI drivers during the installation. So it is quite tricky, but it is possible. So now I did not talk about the LGA 1155 because compatibility with PCI sound cards is iffy at best, but we will take a look at those shortly. But it is still possible on LGA 1155 to get a working sound card. But basically, the only sound card that works on modern motherboards is the Aureal Vortex, the first one and the second one. These will work with modern motherboards. The Yamaha sound cards will also work on these as well. Now, let's take a look at the supported GPUs under Windows 95. So, on the Nvidia side of things, we have the TNT2 Ultra, the Geforce 256, the Geforce 2, the Geforce 3 and 4, the Geforce FX series, and the Geforce 6, which are the last officially supported GPUs, and unofficially the Geforce 7 are also supported. Now, on the ATI side of things, we have the Rage cards, the Radeon 7000s, including the VE variants, the 8000s, the 9000s, and lastly the X 300s and 800s cards as well. So for the last Radeon cards, you need to make sure to use the latest catalyst drivers. Now, for the FX, we won't talk about too much about these because, first of all, I never had one and they are very expensive. But if you can find one, then especially the PCI variants, then basically you are pretty much set because uh, these will be a pretty good experience under DOS, except for maybe OpenGL. So for OpenGL, you will pretty much want to combine this with an Nvidia card. So we will talk about that later. There's also Matrox, which I will pretty much only consider for P3s, P3s, CPUs, and so on. PowerVR Cairo 1 and 2, which I would not recommend, but it is an option. And Intel. Now, in the case of Intel, most of them are integrated. And the 945G is pretty common, and it is possible to have 3D acceleration under Windows 95, but you need to be careful with that. Now, let's take a look at the Nvidia GPUs. So, the FX 5200 Ultra and the non-Ultra variant. While the Ultra is actually pretty rare, but the non-Ultra, they are pretty cheap, they are plentiful, and the performance is decent in older games. It is also quite easy to find them at least with DVI, and you preferably want to have DVI on them because you can then use them with a passive HDMI adapter and then use them on your LCD monitor. Even like 4x3 LCD monitors. The MX440, it is a decent Direct 7 card, and they are also pretty cheap and plentiful. The FX 5500 LE, that is also cheap. Now, usually you will find them in the range of the $10 or so, and they perform much better than the 5200. Now, the Geforce 6 series of cards, as well as the Geforce 7 series of cards, they are actually pretty decent option for PCI Express, but they are not fully stable. But in my case, I was able to get most games running. Now, a few of them had graphical glitches, so we will talk about those later. Especially the variants with more VRAM for the Geforce 7, so that can be an issue, and I will talk about those later. So the TNT2 M64, if you care about some games such as Incoming, because Incoming with cards that are above the TNT2, they will have graphical glitches. So if you care about such games, then the TNT2 M64 is also pretty cheap and easy to find. and it will also perform on the same level as the first TNT, so it's not too bad. Now, the ideal Nvidia GPU. So ideally on Windows 95, what you really want is the FX 5950 Ultra. This is pretty much the best GPU without having to deal with workarounds or unstable drivers. And this will also be the best GPU for pension-free motherboard because first of all they have like the universal AGP connectors, and also the drivers you can use like earlier drivers, and the CPU impact will be quite small, so you will pretty much get the best performance out of them. Now, the only issue with FX cards compared to GeForce 6 or GeForce 7 is that you may not be able to run the latest direct 3D cards games, sorry, especially when it comes to Unreal Engine free games. But if you don't care about those, then it's certainly a good option. Now, the GeForce 4, this is also another great GPU for old CPUs, but unfortunately they have a tendency to die, and you should not overclock these. And I insist on that because all the motherboards will have a hard time with these. And if you overclock them, then you will kill them. In fact, back in the day, there were actually common reports of them of people trying to overclock these cards, and they will actually burn the card and with like the marks on the GPU die. So yeah, not fun. So don't overclock these at all. Even the budget cards, you should not overclock them. Now the GeForce 2 GTS and Ti, this is another good option, but in such cases, I would recommend the MX440 instead. The TNT2 Ultra, I actually have one, but it is dead. Like, it has dead memory. And this is pretty much the best GPU to run incoming without graphical glitches. So if you can find a TNT2 Ultra that works, this is certainly a great GPU. And if you can find one that partially works, then it may be worth repairing. So you may pay like a fee of 50 euros or dollars, but that could be worth it depending on if you actually care about running older games such as incoming properly or at all. Now the GeForce 7950 GT. Now this is not actually a hard GPU to find at a decent price. I was able to buy mine for 20 euros, and I also found some for 10 euros. But the AGP variant of that card, which does exist by the way, is very, very rare. It's like hundreds of dollars worth. So, and one note also on the GeForce 7950 GT, don't buy the variants with a passive cooler because these cards can consume up to hundreds of watts, and a passive cooler will not be enough to cool this card. If you have such a card, you can modify the VBIOS and underclock the card, which is what I've done in my case. And the performance, well, it will be still quite noticeable. You will lose like 5 to 10 FPS. So the trick on the passive variants is that you want to keep the memory clock high, but lower the GPU core clock to by about 100 megahertz. Now the other option that you have is the GeForce 6800 Ultra. This is a pretty good GPU. Does consume a lot of power, so that's a worry. The other card that you can find is the non-ultra variants. That it does include the FX, the Quadro FX variants of it, which I should receive in the mail shortly. and these are also pretty good option for Windows 95. But if you end up with such a card, you might also go with the Geforce 7 cards as well. The compatibility between the Geforce 6 and 7 with the patches applied is pretty much the same under Windows 95. So just saying. And the Geforce 6200 and the non-TC card and the Geforce 7100. These are pretty much the best GPUs that you can find without heatsink, and they should be also pretty easy to find. Now, you may in some cases encounter the turbo cache variants, and the performance of these is pretty bad. So don't buy them. Well, if you end up with one, it's not too bad. It's better than the FX 5200, but still. Now, for Nvidia FX cards, you should prefer driver version 4045 because that driver version is pretty low when it comes to CPU impact. But if you end up with a later driver, the performance impact will be quite significant. Now, the issue with the earlier drivers is that it will not support OpenGL 2 under Windows 95. So if you actually care about support for OpenGL 2 under Windows 95, then in such case you may actually want to use a later driver. But in my opinion, if you actually care about OpenGL games, you should either consider Windows NT4 or just use Windows XP. And in that case, you will have pretty good OpenGL support. Now, for the Geforce 6 cards, you have the option of choosing either the 66.94 driver version, or you can use the very last unofficial release. Now, the issue is that the later release may not be able to play some games, or you may have graphical glitches. Now, in the case of the later driver release, I had the issue with graphical glitches in Chaos Legion, but I'm not sure if that's an issue with the game or the drivers. There's also an issue with Croc 2. That game will not initialize properly on the Geforce 6 and 7 cards. For that game, you will need to use another GPU temporarily, run the game, and then switch over to the Geforce 6 cards. And then you should be able to play the game. Now, you may also use, I will try to, if I can get the game to work again, I will post the registry hack for that game so it can work on Geforce 6 cards, because I'm not sure what's the issue with that game, but I think that's an issue with the game itself, which basically has issues with graphics card with a huge amount of VRAM. And for the Geforce 7 cards, you should use the latest unofficial drivers with the unofficial patches applied. So NV size as well as the RAM patch as well, because if you don't apply the RAM patch, then you will not be able to use video cards with half a gigs on them. So this may or may not be convenient depending on if you want to spend the extra few time on them, or if you just want to have things work out of the box. Now, if you actually want the best performance, then I would say that it is definitely worth spending a few time trying to get the card to work. Now, before the Geforce 256 series, table fog was emulated. Now, from the Geforce 256 and onwards, table fog is supported in hardware. And also, I should point out that the Geforce 6 series, they dropped support for palette textures. So the Final Fantasy VII demo will not work with 3D acceleration. Now, I believe that there are some workarounds for that. But yeah, if that's an issue, you may actually consider the Geforce FX cards. I should also point out that they were actually PCI Express variants of the Geforce FX card. So they are usually called PCX 7550, the PCX 9750, and so on. You get the idea. Basically, the Nvidia cards, the older ones with PCI Express, they have the PCX suffix. So look out for these if you can find one cheap. For flashing, you will want to use an older version. So the version of NV Flash that I use is 5.95.0.1. So that driver version, I was able to flash my GeForce 6 and my GeForce 7 cards under DOS properly. Now, ATI GPUs, I don't actually have one. Well, I was able to try the 7000 VE on the client, but that was the only Radeon card that I was able to use basically. So the GPUs that you should consider is the 9200 SC. That one is really easy to find. The X800 series of cards. These are pretty powerful cards, and they are also easy to find in PCI Express version. They are also AGP variants, but they are almost impossible to find. The 9600 Pro, this is the better mid-range card, but it is AGP4X only. The Radeon 7000 series of cards, it is DirectFreeze 7 only. They are also not supported under Linux anymore, but under Windows 95 they may do the job. But I wasn't satisfied performance-wise because the compatibility on with some features is not that great. So for example, table fog is not supported, and paletted textures are also not supported. And that's an issue with most Radeon cards, in fact all of them. And the performance of that card is not great. Like it is pretty poor. So I would go with the later Radeon cards if possible. And there is also the X300 SE. This is not great performance-wise, but it is quite cheap. And it is better than the 9200 SE card. So that's an option. So for the Radeon cards that you should use ideally is the legendary 9700, but this one is now impossible to find at a decent price. There is also the the 850 XT AGP, but this one is rare, expensive, but it is probably the best AGP card that you can use under Windows 95. For PCI Express, the XT Platinum is the better variant, and it will perform even better under Windows 95. The Radeon 8500 is also another decent DirectFreeze 8 card, but it is very hard to find in my opinion, and I don't recommend this card. Like there are better options. Now, as far as compatibility goes for Windows, now I was complaining about it doesn't support table fog and paletted textures. So yeah, it does not support those, but the drivers for them is actually pretty good performance-wise. And if you want to play a game that does not use table fog or paletted textures, then they are actually quite stable. So That's another plus for ATI cards. So Catalyst 6.2 is the last release for it, and they support the X cards. The ATI Radeon 1050 may also be supported with a hack within the EE file, because the reason why they made it supported is because it is actually based upon the older generation. But this is a quite rare card, so I would not recommend that card. And yeah, I said that unlike later Nvidia cards, there are no obvious compatibility issues in games besides, of course, stable fog and textures and so on. Now, 3D FX. Good luck finding one, first of all, and good luck finding one at a decent price. Now, uh, I don't think that you will find one that is broken. They because most of them they don't deal with 2D, so that's why most of them work for the most part. But yeah, the best free FX cards are easily the Voodoo 4 and 5. But the Voodoo 2 and 3 are pretty good if you only care about glide, basically. And you may also wish to combine this with a Matrox card, because the reason why you want to do that is that the Matrox cards are pretty much the best VGA quality of all cards. And you may actually consider to combine this with an Nvidia GPU, so the FX 5200. So it's actually possible to play OpenGL games on the Nvidia card, but play glide games on the 3D-FX card. So that's an option, if you can find a 3D-FX card that is. Intel GPU, so not recommended because they perform very poorly. Now the 945G is not too bad, but you have to use like embedded drivers, and I believe that only Direct 3D is supported with the unofficial drivers, not OpenGL. But that's something I need to do a bit more of research on, because I'm not actually shown that. And they are also quite slow when it comes to VISA and DOS. But the compatibility with DOS games seems to be good, actually. It's just that the performance of it is not that great. Now, sound cards for ISA, sorry. Most should be decent. Now, there are a few bad ones. So, for example, if you end up with a Mozart card, it's not good in DOS. Well, the games will work, but it will not sound great under DOS. The 064 DSP also fixed several issues, except with the MPU 401, because on the Sound Blaster 16, they will have issues such as the hanging notes bug, as well as the DMA clicking bug as well. The 064 actually fixed those, except for the MPU 404 stuttering issue. So basically, if you try to set it to a frequency above 11 kilohertz, then it will actually stutter during the games. So I would stick with the 064 cards or the Sound Blaster Pro or compatible card. So if you end up with an OPTi card, that's a good option as well. For PCI sound cards, the Aureal Vortex are pretty good. The ESS Solo-1 is also a good option. And the YMF cards are pretty much your best bet. Other cards also include the 064D, which does have a connector for PC Link. Now, I say that, but some people were not able to get SB Link working with that card. So, and that was the only creative card with SB Link on it. Now the Aureal Vortex one, I actually own one that I use in the Enforce motherboard, so I'll talk about that. So you should use the latest drivers, which are on vogons, because otherwise you will encounter issues when it comes to DOS. So basically, if you use the earlier drivers, it will complain about the sound card not being in the primary PCI bus. And if you encounter that issue, you should install the latest drivers. This is pretty much the only sound card that works under DOS with Enforce boards. But unfortunately, even on those, it is not perfect. So FM will work, but the sound effects, they will not work properly. So basically, they will play back, but then they will repeat, and repeat over and over again. So it will end up being a glitchy mess. So I would try to disable sound effects if possible on in the games, but unfortunately, some games don't provide the option to disable Sound Blast sound effects. So that's an issue on endpoint boards. But on most other motherboards, even the newer ones, uh, compatibility is actually pretty good when it comes to motherboards. Unfortunately, it is emulated. So now, in my opinion, the FM sounds okay, but the issue is with games that don't work with the Aureal DOS driver. Now, you can load the driver high and use high MMX, but even then, you will still encounter some games where you will not have any sound at all. So, for example, Stuck Worms on the Enforce board, you will get silence basically, or very low volume. And A3D also works on the Vortex one, but if it's not that great. It's not as good as the Vortex 2. And the TSR can actually be unloaded. I actually read the there's actually an option to unload the TSR, so that's good. But if you unload the TSR, then of course you will not get any sound, so a bit pointless in my opinion. And it can also be loaded high. You can also decide to load it low, so in the conventional memory. But if you end up doing that, then most games will not work at all. So keep that in mind. Now the ESS Solo-1. Now for this card, you need to use a very specific driver release. Otherwise, it will not work under DOS. And you can see the links here. There is also another way to set up the card under DOS, and that's using the PCI set executable. Now, why you want to do that is because, first of all, you can choose the card and tell it to use either DDMA, TDMA, or YSDMA, sorry, YBDMA, sorry. And so yeah, you can choose the DMA mode that you want to set up the card. And this will also not use any TSR. This will not use like any TSR or conventional memory. So for games that are very sensitive when it comes to that, it will work fine. Like you should be able to play the Ultima games on them without any issues, because the Ultima, one of the Ultima games, they use their own DOS extender, and that DOS extender is very infamous for not playing well with some sound cards as well as some motherboards as well. So that's pretty good. Now the code that I'm showing you here, it does not have the SB link connector, but it does have the header for the CD, for the analog audio CD. So not the best ESS sound card. There are better options, but if you only care about FM, that's a good option. Now, some ESS cards will also have a wavetable header. In some cases, it may not be soldered on, so you may have to solder your own. And I would tell you that if you end up with such a card, you should definitely end up you should try to solder it because it is worth it, especially with the Dream Blaster add-ons that you can insert, and those will work under DOS as well. So this is a pretty good sound card. And in my opinion, it is best used on compatible LGA775 motherboards or the ones that come with USB link connectors. But of course, if you want to use in a motherboard with USB link, you need to make sure that your ESS PCI sound card has USB link as well on it. So not a bad sound card, but compatibility is not as good as the Aureal cards. Now, when it comes to DOS games, not only does it sound good, but the compatibility is pretty good as well. Now, compatibility is best like with the SB Link connector and in DDMA mode as well. In TDMA mode, compatibility is okay-ish. Well, actually, it's like 90% compatible, but there are quite a few games that you will not get sound under, so be careful. You may have to patch some games in some cases. So the Yamaha YMF cards, so compatibility is excellent, and the sound is also pretty good as well. Now the issue is that in DSDMA mode, some games will not work because it relies on a TSR for that. But the upside is that compatibility is also good with motherboards. The only exceptions are Enforce motherboards, except the Enforce 4 Ultra, which fixed the issue, but it's still not a great motherboard. And you may also not get sound effects in some SIS chipsets. So the 755 FX and the 671DX. So avoid SIS chipsets also. And if don't buy Enforce boards, basically, they're horrible. Like the PCI sound cards support is terrible. Even back then, people were complaining about PCI sound cards not working at all, even under Windows. So Enforce is pretty bad. Like, don't if you find one, don't buy it. Basically, now the Yamaha cards are pretty rare and expensive, and they cost a premium. And the A3D and EAX support is also not that great. Like they sound worse than the creative or Aureal cards, basically. Now the Sound Blaster Live, ODG, and the ODG2 ZS in Windows 95, you should prefer the VXD drivers over the the WDMA. You should prefer the VXD drivers, sorry, for performance, because the WDM drivers, they have a noticeable performance hit in games, especially in 3D accelerated games, especially EAX games for that matter. Now the Sound Blaster Live, it has like unofficial Vista drivers that works in 64 bits, and I also was able to have success with them in Windows 8 as well. Windows XP 64 bits is also supported in the beta driver by Creative as well. Now the TSR should work on socket A motherboards, but they will not work on ISH7 and N4 boards. Now, I should point out that this is a pretty good sound card for DOS as well, if you have an ISH5 motherboards, because sound and the DOS will still work on it. Now, some games will conflict with the TSR that the Sound Blaster uses, so be careful with that. Now, the Ati Gpus ZS sounds better if you use the headphones, if you use like the analog audio, but it doesn't have the game port and NPU port. The Live does have the game ports and the NPU 401, but it sounds worse. Now, if sound quality is an issue for you, it is possible to use the header on the Sound Blaster Live to get SPDIF support. And in that case, sound quality will be the same as the Ati over SPDIF. So I would consider the Live and the with SPDIF as well. But if that's too much trouble for you, you can just use the Ati Gpus ZS as well. And these are pretty much the best sound cards for EAX and ICH5 boards, as I said earlier. Now the Ensoniq ES 1371. This is one of the few sound cards that work under Windows 3.1. Now this does not mean that you can use that PCI sound cards everywhere. So basically, the interesting thing about this PCI sound card is that it was confirmed to work under a Ryzen system behind a PCIe to PCI bridge. And I was able to try that the same bridge with the B64 a B550 chipset and motherboard, and it was also working under Linux, but I was not able to get it to work under DOS. Like, I had no luck with DOS. And Windows drivers are a problem with that card as well, because you need to use a very specific Windows drivers for it, otherwise it will not work. This sound card is also supported under Linux, but there's not much point in using that. But they are pretty cheap, and but in my opinion, you should avoid this sound card because the DOS compatibility is not that great. It sounds really bad when it does work, and I would only consider this card for Windows basically, and that's it. Now the CMI 8738. Now this so this is basically a chip, a sound chip, and you can easily find them online. So if you search for PCI sound card on AliExpress, you will only find this sound chip. And now some of them they don't have FM support, so some later revisions removed them. So avoid the ones that have the O37D mark. These will not have working Sound Blaster emulation. Now I say emulation, but the FM parts in that sound chip, it actually sounds pretty good. But PCM sounds in DOS, it basically doesn't work. Like most games, you might get some working sound, but in most cases it will not work at all. So this should be considered at best an active card, and if you see it that way, then it's not a bad option. If you can have if you have basically a compatible motherboard. Now, it is pretty compatible when it comes to motherboard compatibility. And if you use like the remap CMI tool, then you will have better luck with that sound card on newer chipsets. The interesting thing about this sound chip, is that it has open source Windows drivers. So it will work fine on the 64 bits operating systems as well. Though you may need to make sure to disable driver signature enforcement. And because of that, they also work great under React OS. Now there are some variants that removed, as I said earlier, some Blaster Pro compatibility, and I wasn't able to find reports that the PCI Express versions of the cards worked under DOS at all. Now, this could be down to several things. Now, I wasn't able to find someone that used the remap CMI tool with the PCI Express variants. I had no reports when it comes to that. So it's possible to get a PCI Express version to work under DOS, but I wasn't able to find anyone that had success with that. So yeah. Now other notes. So the unofficial AHCA driver, it works under Windows 95, but it may not work properly if you use it with a DVD drive and a SATA drive. So basically the issue is that if you end up with both, sometimes the DVD drive may misbehave. So basically it will start and stop, start and stop. So basically it makes the drive unusable. And the how I was able to notice is that basically I took out the SSD SATA drive and I use an IDE drive instead in my Enforce motherboard. And suddenly the DVD drive just worked like fine. Now, if that's an issue to you and you want to use an SSD on your computer, the easy solution is just to use a USB DVD drive. And these will work out of the box under Windows 95. Now, you should use the HiMemX and apply the RAM patch, the unofficial RAM patch. The reason why you want to use HiMemX over the official HiMem.sys file is because it uses less conventional memory over the standard HiMem file, basically. So compatibility with DOS games, it should be better. Now for Geforce 7 Nvidia cards, you need to use the unofficial patcher. Otherwise, they will not work at all. Now, I had good success with as I said, with the Nvidia 7950 GT. Even the version with more memory, so the 500 megabytes of VRAM, that worked fine under Windows, but it seems that I'm encountering some graphical glitches on that version. So you should prefer the Nvidia GeForce 7 cards with less VRAM if possible. Now, as I said before, using two IDE to SATA adapters may result in the system not booting at all. That's an issue that I encountered on socket A motherboards. The following VIA south bridges, so the 82T68 6B and the VT8231. Those on those you can use a utility called VRSB config. And on such VIA south bridges, they have Sound Blaster emulation. Now, the cool thing about that is that you can use the CMI sound card for FM and use the south bridges for sound effects. So it's kind of a tricky setup, but the result is that you can pretty much get you get like perfect, almost perfect FM sounding sound in DOS, as well as working sound effects. Now, it's tricky because you need to disable the FM sound part in the VIA in the VIA tool, and you also need to use like an audio cable to mix the two. So basically, you need to mix the onboard sound with the sound card, and then um, towards your speakers, and that's a rare setup because those south bridges usually you can find them on either thin clients or on P3 boards, and usually you have better options than than using that tricky setup, but it is an option. There are also some other PCI Express cards that are supported, so you can use the GMB 36X. This is a SATA controller, although there's not much point if you use the unofficial SATA drivers. And you can also use the Broadcom BC57 PCI Express card. These will work under Windows 98. Now, it might be possible to use later networking cards under Windows ME. The issue with Windows ME is that for DOS, you need to use unofficial patches to get restart to DOS, basically. So Windows ME might be an option, but in most cases, you are better with Windows 98 instead. So that's pretty much it for this video. I will make another video with my setup, which is not ideal, and basically show you how the GeForce 7 card works. So yeah, bye.